Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Good to see you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi, Arnie. I've got good news from Canada. We're going into winter, you're going into summer. And sometimes the harvests are held back by rainy weather and that sort of thing, or just snow or whatever. And sometimes the harvests are completed in the spring. I'm told in Alberta that the harvest is pretty well cleaned up.
That's wonderful news.
Yeah, farmers are got a fairly decent crop and they've got it all off.
That's wonderful news. That is such good news, Wallace. And I think that, to me, that highlights the diversity of weather patterns around the globe. We're in spring and second month, October, and we've had very good season opening rains. And the fact is, I shouldn't confess this, but this is true. I've got a back paddock. It's about 2,000 square metres. And I went in there the other day with a whippersnapper and a metal blade, not nylon, and I cut down grasses that were more than 6 foot high.
Holy doodles. We don't get that.
I was 6 foot high. These grasses are in there, and I'm in there with whippersnap because I was talking to the neighbour. He wanted to spray. I don't want him to spray because I've got bees, and bees don't like to spray. In fact, it kills them. And I thought the least I can do is meet him halfway and go and cut this grass. And so I was in there with a whippersnapper, and some of the trunks were like 2 inches across of these of mustard weeds and things like that. So yes, we're doing okay. Season opening, all my water tanks are full. The ground is moist, and the hives that I've got, only a couple around the place in the yard, but they have to be off the ground. So it's certainly a very, very good start to our season, and it's good news that you've had your a good result for it. We're watching the weather patterns across the Eyre Peninsula, which I've been across there several times, and it is so dry, and yet they've had good rains. So it seems as if the solar cycles, we're in this sort of minimum phase of the solar cycle, and it seems as if the weather falls into a more discernible pattern. To me, it's like that.
Predictable.
More predictable, yeah. I sort of get the feeling going around Australia, because I've been doing that for since I was a pup, and I get the feeling that in this period we're actually coming out of a drought. And that we've been in a drought for so long in Australia, we've forgotten what it's like to not be in a drought. It was just, you travelling across the hay plains and things like that, and it's 40 plus degrees. And it really is, you think you're actually exposed with the heat. You're travelling for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles across hay fields. And yes, they grow, but at the same time, boy, along that Murrumbidgee, it's dry. It is so dry and so hot, and the summers are so harsh. But that's Australia. And no doubt you've got the cold, which is Canada. So we've both got our variety, our extremes of weather that we have to manage. Okay, this week, I'm going to cut across to a website I just want to present to you. One of the speakers at our national webinar 2 weeks ago was Bernard Gaynor, and he actually has a podcast on The Good Source, and that's this website, The Good Source. What drew me to this website, it was just part of my normal lap, was this third article and the lockdown crisis. The governor has a role to play, and this Professor David Flint, he's a constitutional professor. And what he's suggesting in this video plus audio plus article is that the role of the governor is vital. And he's suggesting that the governor actually withhold assent for this omnibus bill, this COVID-19 omnibus emergency amendment bill that's being proposed in Victoria. Now, this is just sweeping powers of where the health minister can deputise virtually anyone. and they can, on the basis of that deputisation, they can arrest anyone and hold them virtually forever. They can hold them if they suggest that they're a threat to the biosecurity of the nation, of the state, and that them insisting on they're not a threat, but they just want to exercise their freedom of speech, their freedom of thought, their freedom of action, their freedom of movement. And this omnibus bill challenges all of that. And it says, no, you can't, you shall not, you will not. Now, Victoria's experienced 6 months of lockdown, 6 months under this communist premier and his executive. And they're just arbitrarily doing this and doing that, and they're coming up with new figures. Every day there's a press conference and a new set of baloney figures that mean nothing. And this whole state has been in lockdown. And of course, you start to consider, okay, this is what communism is about. Now we're experiencing it. What is democracy about? What is Christianity about? Because that is a very, very important consideration right now. We have been progressively communised over the last 50 years. And I can virtually name the day that the socialist teachers came out of university, came into the high school. I was at Belmont High School. I was about 13 or 14 years old. And they virtually threw away all of the old curricula. And they came in with new, and it really was a dropkick curricula where you no longer learnt, you just copy and paste. And that's exactly what we did. We photostatted books, we glued them onto a folder, and we handed that in, and that was our understanding of dropkick subjects like Sino-Japanese War. Whereas we abandoned the history of Australia. We abandoned our culture. We abandoned our constitutional development, our Westminster system, our common law, our trial by jury, habeas corpus, Magna Carta, all of these profound, if you like, high watermarks of culture, of civilization. We abandoned the lot in favour of a copy and paste dropkick subject about the Sino-Japanese War. And the only thing I got out of that was the influence of opium through China. And I find it interesting because I occasionally watch martial arts movies on TV, and the narrative is that the British introduced opium to China, and the British say that it was the Chinese who were doing it. And the fact is that the if you like, the control of that nation, China, the Opium Wars were very important as part of the structure to, if you like, to disenfranchise, to deunify the Chinese people and have them fighting each other so that they could then be managed. So as a strategy, opium was used to deconstruct that culture. So it certainly advanced if you like, the invaders, as far as I can see. But that wasn't part of the history that I was taught. It's only in these latter years that I look at that same events and look at them in a different light. Now, I'd suggest that to me, the critical thing that we've got to come to grips with as individuals is that we have to actually re-educate ourselves. We have to re-educate. We have to go back to the books and start from the beginning. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, there's a lot of material that you can draw from for curriculum in teaching. So if you want to downplay some things and not even necessarily emphasize others, but just downplay by shifting the attention to some other focus, then it's easy to do. And this has been going on now for a long time. I don't think any kind of civics or constitutional history is taught significantly in the educational system in Canada. We've got more teaching of political correctness and the history, the evolution of well, affirmative action and things like this. That's the sort of thing that is drawn to students' attention as the focus of their interest today. And in fact, I am a pretty active reader, and I like history. I majored in history at university, and the books I read now are pretty impressive books, but I find that they are a reinterpretation of history, and they are obviously well financed. People have been liberated to do years of research, but I think they're giving a new twist to the interpretation of history that is going to be very hard now to free ourselves from if it is inaccurate or if it is a little bit perverse. So, the communists have always concentrated on education and rewritten traditional concepts of history. Now, I would concede that probably some traditional concepts of history deserve some re-examination, but I don't think that's what's going on now. I think they are creating a whole new generation of texts, history books, that will be the source of information and orientation for people in the future. It's part of the revolutionary program. I'm sure a lot of the financing is coming from these big foundations. You can see that often in the credits at the beginning of books. They thank these foundations for providing the financing. But you have the heads of departments, history departments or other departments at university, and they are the ones who are awarding grants for research. And all these research projects have an orientation. There's an idea among people who aren't familiar with the academic community that it is impartial and objective. And there might be some objectivity to it, but still the granting of monies for research is primordial, and it can give a slant to studies that transforms the thinking of a whole academic world. I remember when the feminists were going strong in practically every field of study at university, sociology or history or whatever, economics. If you could come up with a study, a proposed study that focused on the injustice done to women in the past, you were almost assured of getting a grant to do that. Well, the result was that the whole academic world shifted to be focused on this feminist agenda. And the same thing happened with the climate change thing. If you came up with the right project, a project that aligned with global warming or climate change or whatever they're calling it now, then you would get a grant. And anybody who dissented would be shut out. So this results in grave transformations of the whole orientation of the academic community, and I detect it personally in the history field because of I've read lots of older history texts, and now I've read new texts, and I find the new texts are impressive often in their research, but they just have a different philosophical orientation, a sympathy toward socialism or Marxism that you wouldn't have found in texts, 80 years ago. And the people who are reading these, the young students, are just going to absorb that attitude. So this is a serious problem that we're going to have a great deal of difficulty escaping from.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's certainly a very interesting opening salvo. I noted just this weekend I spoke to a lady from Britain, Frances Hutchinson, and she reminded me of a game called, I think it was the Money Game or something like that. And it was tied up with Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit or whatever. And it was the precursor to what we know today as monopoly. And the thing is that the whole origins of that game was to educate people about economics. It was there as a tool. It was there as a training and development tool to think in a certain fashion and to accept monopoly as a fact of life, which of course it isn't. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, absolutely. Just to put it in a nutshell, we are engaged in an ideological war, conflict. There's a struggle, an ideological struggle going on. And that means that the one side is more inclined to freedom as they see it. And then there's the other side that is clearly collectivist. And, I didn't go to university until I was 30. But so when I got there, I probably looked at it a little bit differently than a brand new student. But I came fairly quickly to realize that there was a process of change going on, and it was an ideological change that was being insinuated into the situation. That's one of the devious things about it. These people, they don't just stand up on a soapbox and say, this is what we stand for. They use all sorts of little ways of intruding certain concepts into your thought processes. And so I don't consider it's honest. And if you can't be honest about what you're doing, I think you have to be very much suspect. No, I mean, we had certain essays to read and so on, for instance, in political science. I didn't realize it at the time, but some were authors from the Frankfurt School in Germany, which is a Marxist educational institute. So these ideas were being put forward, and the students were kind of sitting ducks because they're not usually mature enough to detect these more subtle psychological techniques for influencing the mind of the listener. So there's no doubt about it that there has been a change. And the change has been to rather, I could say sneeringly, but I should say contemptuously in a way, or in a way that sort of makes fun of anyone who clings to ideas that might have come from an earlier period in history. In other words, change was obviously emphasized, and the change was toward the socialist, collectivist orientation toward life. And I think that there was a certain amount of unfairness on part of some of the staff in marking papers and things like that. They varied. Some were more objective and more fair than others, but there were some who obviously, in my opinion, had an objective. And they weren't just exposing students to different ideas and letting them make up their mind. They were surreptitiously planting certain notions in their consciousness. And I think one of them, of course, was and has been stressed increasingly, is the evil the nations of the West perpetrated in their treatment of other nations which they had colonized and so on. And one would not want to sanitize all these things, but it's made an institutional thing almost to accept that we're bad people. We moved in on these people, took their resources and exploited them. In other words, they have suffered on account of us, even though they probably didn't have anything when we arrived. And I think we could make a reasonable statement to the effect that they probably wouldn't have had much, even now, if the West had not moved there and brought Western technology and Western culture. So I think it's a little bit devious and dishonest to say that all we did was exploit people. Because the people today, they're those people's ancestors, or their followers, they have enjoyed things they would never, ever, ever have enjoyed if it had not been for Western culture. So I think that it's not just an objective attempt to portray the interaction of civilizations. It's an attempt to discredit the West and make them appear to be exploitative, brutal, and this is part of the power struggle that's going on. There's an attempt being made to demonize the people who the one group, the revolutionaries, want to replace. So I really don't feel that university experience is necessarily a terribly edifying thing, unless you're in a sub area of study that really has nothing to do with politics or that sort of thing. So I think there's been definitely a change in the educational system. I think it's been a revolutionary change. I think it's been quite deliberate and quite cleverly carried out because it hasn't been done above board.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's certainly profound, deep thinking about this whole question of education and whether it is drawing someone out or it's actually implanting thoughts. It's indoctrination. And that to me is what I'm witnessing, what I'm seeing. My discussions with people from Victoria is that some are absolutely in love with the Premier. He can do no wrong. Even though it's been demonstrated that he was acting arbitrarily, there was no legal justification for the things that he was doing. And there is no justification. And here it is, he's going after more power with this Omnibus Act. But on top of that, what we're also uncovering this week, at least it was revealed late last week, is that the federal government, the Conservative, if you want to call it that, Liberal government in Canberra, who are not Labor and Socialists, supposedly Conservative Liberal, but they're not. They're just as communistic as the state of Victoria, is actually operating just as vigorously, unconstitutionally, as is the state of Victoria. And that there is an executive, the national executive, and that in the Constitution there is no such thing. But here it is, the whole country, the whole nation is having this imposition of a medical tyranny, and the Conservatives, the Liberal politicians in Canberra with the bureaucrats are actually driving the whole thing. So it's an orchestrated combination of the two major parties working together, working in concert to bring about revolutionary situation in Australia. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I think probably that phenomenon is going on in all Western countries now, Arnie. I know that I think it was last Monday, that the UK Parliament voted on the renewing of the COVID legislation for another 6 months. So the British can expect to have more of the same for another half a year at least, and it's definitely going to go on beyond that if the projection of the World Bank that it's going to go on till 2025 is true. But interestingly enough, this must have been one of the most important votes in British history or UK history, and only about half the MPs showed up to vote. You have to wonder what in the world is going on. It seems as if parliaments have been downgraded to such a point that they're virtually irrelevant now. And there have been some complaints among MPs that you cannot keep renewing these controls without subjecting them to parliamentary scrutiny. But obviously, the executives don't want scrutiny. We certainly see that here in Canada. And what's remarkable is I don't know who is behind this policy exactly, but it has these front men. You have that Fauci character in the United States. In Canada, we have a woman named Tam. These are the chief medical officers in the jurisdiction. But somehow they've been put in a position where they can dictate to the entire population without being subjected to any effective criticism or even interrogation. It's a remarkable situation. So we have dictatorships being set up in multiple countries simultaneously. This is not just in one area of the world. This is going on certainly in all of the European countries and in the Western tradition countries, that they have these medical specialists whose qualifications actually are often very questionable. And they are laying down rules that determine in detail what people can and cannot do. I think it's really virtually unprecedented in history. I don't think even the Mongol tribes had controls like that over their population. It's astonishing. And I saw a presentation by a German lawyer who says that he is organizing a massive tort action. I mean, it's like world scale tort action to hold people accountable for the damage they've done under these COVID regulations. And again, he said there is one man in Germany who for years has been the one who decided what medical policy would be applied there. And he is the one now who is dictating the behavior that Germans can indulge in this alleged pandemic period. So it's really something. There's a medical officer in Toronto who made an amazing statement the other day. She said that she wanted to have the provincial government of Ontario extend her powers because she is afraid. She's consulted a lawyer and she was advised that she could be personally liable for damage that she is causing by imposing COVID controls. I thought that was a very interesting remark, and I hope that a lot of these people are beginning to think that that might be a possibility. They probably believe they have absolute impunity and immunity to any kind of legal action, but if they could just be, the idea could be planted in their heads that at some point they might be held personally responsible for a lot of this, it might give them pause. I'm really thinking that might be a good strategy to follow in toning down their ambitions to dictate to the population.
Yeah.
There is one thing, Marna, you mentioned the game Monopoly. I'm going to just recount an anecdote. When I used to work for a political party in the House of Commons in Canada, and one day I got a call and I was invited to sit in on a game of Monopoly with a bunch of MPs from all the parties. I was a researcher, but I was the only English-speaking person in this particular party. So they needed an English participant and they chose me. Well, I hadn't played Monopoly for about 10 years. I'd forgotten all the rules. I didn't prepare myself properly for the game. And we went in there, and unfortunately, I was also young and a little bit intimidated by the presence of all these MPs. But I remember that they got to where they had to get a fresh infusion of financial credit in order to carry on in the game. And I always regretted I never said, now hold on, where is that bank getting its credit that it can loan to these enterprises so that they can carry on their activities? I think it would have been a very good point. The game was actually broadcast on national radio, and it's a regret I have that I didn't point out that the banks create credit out of nothing, and that this was being totally ignored by all the MPs participating in this game.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'll just highlight that the front page of the Australian today talks about the $1.1 trillion debt that Australia faces as a consequence of this lockdown. And yet when the lockdown was first imposed, our Prime Minister was able to garnish as much credit as he liked. He was using, if you like, I don't know if it was fractional reserve, but it was also an expansion of the money supply through the federal government's ability through the Reserve Bank of Australia. Now, Belarus recently, their president refused to accept the lockdown conditions that the IMF was imposing that the IMF insisted upon as a condition of the loan to Belarus. The president rejected it, but obviously our Prime Minister of Australia didn't reject it. He accepted it and he imposed a lockdown, and that's what we're actually experiencing. And I think this is very, very important. The players behind the scenes that are actually controlling this whole scenario is to do with finance. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Absolutely. Finance controls everything. Just think for a moment, what can you do without money? We live in a money economy. All obligations are legally determined, and money is the instrument or the medium in which we use to settle obligations. So really, you can't produce. What can you produce without a bank loan? What can you mobilize in the way of resources if you don't have financial capital with which to? I mean, financial capital is not something you go out into the forest and pick off the trees. It is something that didn't exist and is made to exist deliberately by an accountancy function of the banks. They simply write up an account, and that credit becomes an addition to the money supply. And it allows you to do something. I think you had a little book out in Australia a while ago about licenses to live. And that's exactly what money is. It's licenses to produce, licenses to consume. And if you don't have a proper balance between the two, you're going to have dysfunction in your society and your economy, and life is not going to be what it should be optimally, or even approximately optimally. So there's no doubt about it that money definitely plays a major role in a lot of these things that go on, because all you have to do is withdraw the extension of credit, and you can ruin someone. You can ruin their whole life. You can destroy everything they've tried to do. And most people are not too comfortable with that situation. Some of these young people demonstrating in Toronto said that, well, they were asked about this, the possibility of repercussions, and they said it doesn't matter. They said freedom is not negotiable. And so it doesn't make any difference what magnitude of fines we are assessed or anything like that. We have no intention of backing off one bit, because freedom is not negotiable. Anyone who tries to take your freedom away is exercising power in violation of natural law. It's an abuse of the other party, the victimized party. And you know, most people really do have to live. If they don't get enough food every day, if they have no place to sleep, especially in Canada during the winter time, they're gonna be brought in line, and they won't have to be told very much to make them do it. They understand the risks that are involved in opposing the powers that be and the policies that they impose upon the rest of society. So we're living in a top-down world where policy comes from the top, and policy not only comes from the top, it is enforced from the top against the will of those at the lower end of the totem pole or the pyramid. And the tragedy is, of course, that a lot of people don't even know that they're in a pyramid of power exactly. They don't really understand the nature of it. They certainly don't understand the role that finance plays in it, because it's a much more sophisticated influence than most people encounter in their daily affairs. So it's something that requires education. It requires morality. It requires determination, and it requires a certain amount of skill. And that is a pretty big challenge when you're trying to combat what these people in higher places are doing to mislay the people at large who are not really engaged in all sorts of sophisticated operations in the financial world. Some of these things are not even that sophisticated if you know what they are. But the thing of it is, if you don't know, it's no help.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's exactly right. That the role that finance plays, and the inordinate influence that it has over the whole political process, but not only the political process, but also, we touched on earlier, the education process. These foundations that are actually causing certain patterns of thought to happen through our education and indoctrination systems. We really need to actually take a step back and have a look at how do we actually deconstruct the narrative, and how are we going to be effective in our, if you like, our fight for freedom, because that's where we are. We're actually fighting for our freedoms now. Your thoughts, please, and 38-minute mark, closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, mentioning the conditioning of our pattern of thoughts, Arnie, there is great attention paid to making sure that we conceive of money in the right way. And usually it's the wrong way. I noted that, I always notice, in fact, that when they're talking about governments relaxing the financial tap and being a little more generous in their financing of economic activity, that the formula that is always presented in the press, and particularly I find in conservative circles that are critical of government spending money, if the governments weren't spending money, a lot of people would be in much worse circumstances than they are now. It's unfortunate the way they spend it and the way they tote it up as debt, but it's a good thing that banks and governments are injecting money into the economy. It's the only thing that keeps people going. But always when the government is relaxing controls on money, as it happened recently now with the immense borrowings to deal with the COVID crisis, which I think in any case are fraudulent, because in Canada they borrowed $343 billion, and only $80 billion of that is going to be spent on tiding people over through this crisis. Well, that leaves a huge amount of money in the hands of a government with all kinds of sociological and demographic experiments that it's conducting to pursue those activities. And I think that this COVID thing is actually a cover for a lot of projects that have nothing to do with health. Anyway, that's a sideline. But as I said, they always portray this in the same way, and the commentators in the press and on TV will say that the government has activated the printing presses. This is designed to create a false impression of the nature of money, because practically all money has nothing to do with printing presses. 95% of money is financial credit. So this is a deliberate attempt to keep people from an accurate understanding of the nature of money. And it's just something that they resort to constantly. And the assumption is that the running of the printing presses is a bad thing. It's used as a negative portrayal of what's going on. But it's not only not a bad thing that money is being made available to the community. It has to be made available in some way. Too bad it's being made available only as debt, which is going to have to be repaid. That seems like a strange way to add money to an economy, because it's all going to be withdrawn eventually in the repayment of the debts. But this business of representing it falsely as a you have visions of printing presses spewing out dollar bills or whatever currency is involved. It's not currency, it's financial credit, and that is created by the banking system merely by the entry of figures in a ledger or the typing of numbers into a computer. That money doesn't exist before the bank does that. And that is how it comes into being. And as I say, it's a good thing it comes into being, but it's a bad thing that it creates an obligation to the banks that is going to be a burden on the population for generations to come.
Thank you for that, Robert. I want to cut across before I give you the floor, Wally. I want to cut across to two websites. One is this one here about a bloke called Norman Angel. And I've actually got the game in my hand. It's called The Money Game by Norman Angel. And there's also another game, and it's called The Landlord's Game. And this was to do with, I think it was Georgian thinking at the time. Now, these games were initiated and teaching people about the role of, if you like, money in the economy and how monopolies came about to control. And so it was essentially, if you like, the preliminary education about liberalism, neoliberalism, or libertarianism of this dog-eat-dog world. And that was what it was promoting. And it's a tool for mastery, if you like, in the end, of this rampant individualism of dog-eat-dog. And I think that society could actually do so much more. Individuals in association could do so much more rather than dog-eat-dog. Your thoughts, please, Wallace, and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Do you operate on the basis of dog-eat-dog? Do you try and take your neighbor or members of your family for everything you can? I don't think so. That's simply not a civilized attitude toward life. And the thing of it is, with money, it's an instrument of power because it can initiate action. That's where money has its power. It can initiate production. It can initiate consumption. And our problem is with our economy, our financial aspect of it, is that it does not provide the means to recover the costs of production, the costs that industry has incurred. And most people are intelligent enough to realize that if you have costs and you're in business and you don't have enough receipts to cover your costs, you're not likely to stay in business very long. It just makes elementary sense. And yet you hear people say, well, they should cut back. Also, you're going to have bankruptcies going on right, left, and center. People said, well, that could maybe make it worse. Well, then cut back a little bit less. Don't cut back too much. They don't understand the nature of business accountancy. And I don't profess to be an expert in it in any way, but I do know some of the elementary principles, the ones which I consider are really critical. And that's that the present system is not self-liquidating. And just to make that simple, it means that business can't recover its costs. Well, if it can't recover its costs, how does it manage to stay in business, to sell? It's because the banks come in with regard to a new cycle of production, and they create money for it. And that allows old debts to be paid, but it creates new debts in the process. And the way it works, the debts get bigger and bigger proportionately. And so you become less solvent as a nation or as a business. And if you push this far enough, I mean, the way we overcome it is we simply get the banks to create more credit. But that usually, as we can see lately, that has been done to the advantage or to the facility, the policy of the government. In other words, it's a shift of power from the individual or from individuals to the state. And that is, in its final form, communism. And the present system has been set up in such a way as gradually to centralize power. I mean, I don't think anybody will argue that it is not accepted that probably about 90 some odd percent of the population own the capital wealth of the nation in the States, for instance. And I should say 3%, not 90%. 3-4% of the population own the capital assets or wealth of the nation. And that has happened because the system works to centralize power. It works in such a way that you get people producing like mad by being easy on extending credit. Let them be activated and produce. And then on some excuse, typically of inflation, they pull the rug out. They pull the rug out from these producing organizations, and because they need a constant stream of credit in order to function, that puts them in a position where they go into bankruptcy, and the creditor, the lender, ends up taking the assets. And this is a dynamic process that goes on. It's inherent in the fundamental design of the financial system. And so it's because it's true today, it's more true tomorrow, and it's more and more and more true tomorrow. And the situation just gets worse. Well, we've gone just about as far as we can go about placing productive assets in the hands of a few. And I think this is one of the situations that the powers that be are having to face. And they are having to be a little bit more creative about how they maintain their game. And that's why you see, rather than telling people if they don't have enough money, they can just starve, or they can share their money, or they can rely on charity, or they can get by on a little bit of welfare. Now they're producing streams of credit or money in order to sustain people during a period of crisis. Well, this is to do very fundamentally with the displacement of labor by technology. We don't need all those people working today. It's not necessary. And some of them are probably just as well off not working because they might not be too much help if they were there. But the thing of it is, life is about life. And life is consuming. You're consuming goods, you're consuming services, you're enjoying things which are offered by others. And that's what makes life worth living. And now they're telling us that in effect, they're talking more and more about the supply chain likely suffering. We heard today that price of foodstuff has gone up markedly over the last short period. There's going to be we're told that we should get accustomed to shopping only once a week. We should think about what we're doing and just shop once a week. Well, people shop for all sorts of things. They shop because they're looking for a little bit of variation in their life, maybe someone to talk to, maybe to go to somewhere to enjoy a drink or something with friends. It's not just a question of sitting at home and then running off to the store to get what you need to survive and then coming back again. You see, it's control. It's control. When they try and tell you how you should shop, that's getting pretty damn intimate. It's getting really intrusive. It is affecting your life materially because it is imposing upon you certain conditions of your life. And I think it has got to stop. And the people who are of that mentality, who seem that they were ordained to push other people around, it's time they were given to understand that it's not going to be tolerated. As one fellow said it, he said, I'm not looking to harm anyone. He said, I just want my life. I just want my life back. It's being stolen away.
Mm. Thank you for that, Wally. That's exactly right. We want our lives back, and we don't want to be annoyed or bullied by bureaucracy or by the government. This is where it comes down to. This is the choices that we're actually making in this age. And we're seeing it in Victoria. We're seeing it escalating in other nations, and recognising that the design has gone on for at least in our own nations that I'm aware of for the last 50 or 60 years. The actual purpose, the outworking of policy to bring about, in the end, a totalitarianism, a technocracy, an age
I think Douglas
Yeah.
really had it. He really hit the nail on the head when he said, if people behave sometimes in a manner that is antisocial or that is unpleasant, when they're annoyed, then maybe it'd be a good idea to stop annoying them.
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. And let people just get on with their own life. And those that are not terrified by crossing the street or going for a swim or whatever it is that they do in their normal function of life, and the risks that are exposed to, they should be free to get on with their life. And those that are in fear and trepidation of something that's out there that's going to, whatever it is that it's going to do, okay, they can lock themselves in a jail. They can lock themselves in some sort of incubator, whatever. But the rest who want to actually live their life should get on and do it. And this book, I'll just close this out. This book that is here, it is The Money Game, and by Norman Angell. And I believe this was done after The Landlord's Game, and The Landlord's was actually orientated around Georgian people. Last website for the day, and that is that in Wallace's analysis of progressive debt, you've only got to go to the debt clock and recognise that the levels of debt, 27 trillion for America. This is absolutely phenomenal, the levels of debt, and it's climbing. None of it is going backwards, because that's the nature of the, if you like, the disparity between prices and incomes, and the gap that it is irredeemable, that the economy can't function without increasing debt. And there it is. It's in red and green, if you like. It's in black and white for you to see every single day. It's not going backwards. It's continuing to climb.
And some people have asked me. They've asked me, who does this debt belong to?
Mm.
Well, I'll tell you, it belongs to you, it belongs to me and to Bob and everybody else, because it is money that has been filched away from the community.
That's right.
And that is a means of oppression. It withdraws from the community the ability to live their lives to the extent that it does, and it forces them to engage in further activity as slaves to an economic machine in order that they can make a futile effort to deal with even their personal debts.
That's
It
right.
belongs to the community, that credit. It does not belong to the banks. How often do you have to say it? It belongs to the community. It does not belong to the banks. They carry out a currency function. Fine, that's legitimate. They've got no right to claim ownership of the money that they are accounting.
Exactly right.
It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. And the fact is, the ruse has been going on at least for the last 400 years. 1694, the establishment of the Bank of England. And 400 years we've seen this thing encroaching, and the debts, the national debt established in 1694 has never been repaid. And here it is, it's got to the stage where the whole Joseph, with his coat of many colours, when he enslaved Egypt, he enslaved them by monopolising the grain market. And he was an economist, and he enslaved them. And they ended up selling themselves and their cattle and their land and all their assets and even their very own children into slavery. And that's the same sort of collusion, conniving that's going on in front of us. We've got to wake up. We've got to actually do our civics. We've got to do our homework. We've got to read our history. And this is the whole purpose of what we're doing here at the Australian League of Rights, is actually to give you an opportunity to re-educate yourself and then to take that knowledge and to do your civic duty, your civic responsibility. Thank you so much, Wallace and Robert, for today's The Crossroads Forum. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Arnie. We will talk again very soon.
Cheers.